This shir is dedicated Le'ilui Nishmas Sarah Rivka Bas Harav Nachum Umindel Sarah Lam Drach. I'm going to be discussing Perek Nun Gimel of Sefer Tehillim. Perek Nun Gimel is almost an exact duplicate of Perek Yud Daled, which was previously beautifully discussed by Rabbi Mel David. There are, however, certain subtle differences in the words used and some of the phrases used in the two prakim, and many of the Meforshim understood that as a result, these two prakim were really focused on different things. Amongst the Rishonim, for example, Rashi and Metzudas David both understood these prakim as referring to the Churban of Bayit Rishon and Bayit Sheni. Specifically, Perek Yud Daled was referenced the Churban Bayit Rishon, which occurred on the part of the Bavlim, on the part of Nebuchadnezzar, and Perek Nun Gimel discusses the Churban Bayit Sheni, which was conducted on the part of the Romans, and specifically the commander Titus. Radak, on the other hand, also understands Perek Yud Daled as a reference to the Churban Bayit Rishon and the Galus Bavli. However, he understands Perek Nun Gimel as not referring to an event that occurred historically in the past, but rather to an event that's going to occur in the future, in the period of Mashiach, and says that it's associated with the calamities surrounding the Milchemet Gog uMagog, the wars associated with Gog and Magog that are going to precede the Messianic era. Amongst the Achronim, however, most view these two prakim not necessarily as focused on historical events or events concerning Klal Yisrael in terms of things that either happened or will happen in the future, but rather relate to the human condition. And even so, they emphasize certain important differences. So what I'm going to do is to focus very much on the differences, the way in which Perek Nun Gimel is different from Perek Yud Daled. But before doing that, I'd like to first just briefly review the content of Perek Nun Gimel. It's a short perek, only 7 psukim, and I'd like to just read and translate it for you. The perek begins, Lama Natseach al Machalat Maskil David. Right, again, it's a perek that was written to be accompanied by music, perhaps in the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore it's a Lama Natseach. And the word Machalat is an obscure word. Many of the Rishonim believe that it most likely refers to some sort of musical notation, either the music itself or to an instrument that was used in the performance of this particular perek of Tehillim, although some observe that the word Machalat is very similar to the word Machala, which implies a disease of some sort, and make note of the fact that much of the perek is focused on the spiritually diseased state of the people that are being referenced. The expression maskil is an expression that suggests a means of acquiring a greater understanding, a means of elevating our understanding of what it takes to become spiritually closer to Hashem, and it's an expression that's used with many of the other prakim in Sefer Tehillim. The perek continues, Ama naval belibo. The term naval is an expression that's commonly translated as a fool, sometimes as a base or impure person. You get the general idea. Ama naval belibo. The naval, the fool, says in his heart, Ein Elohim, there is no God. Hishchitu vehit ivu avel, Eino setov. As a result of this attitude that there is no God, there is no one to hold us accountable, then they deal corruptly, they sin, they do whatever they want, they do abominable things, and they commit all sorts of acts of injustice, and the pasuk concludes, no one does good. Continues, Elohim mishamayim hishkif al bnei Adam. God from heaven looks down upon the sons of men, upon the human race. Lirot, hayesh maskil dorash et Elokim. Is there a single person, is there anyone there of understanding who seeks out God? Rav Hirsch in his commentary points out that the only way to find God, the only way to experience God and to get close to Him spiritually is to engage in a rational process of trying to understand Him, of seeking Him out, trying to study and to learn and to see what you can about him, both from the natural world as well as from the Torah. And in doing so, you get to be a better appreciation, a better understanding of Hashem, and that elevates your spiritual status. The base person, the person who's driven entirely by their desires and wants and needs, such a person is reluctant to engage in this type of quest and put in the effort necessary to seek out and get a better understanding of Hashem. And the reason is because they're afraid that this would somehow interfere with their ability to satisfy their urges, to satisfy their wants and desires. The Perek in Tehillim continues, Kulo sag, all have become dras, all have become base. Yachtav ne'elachu, together they have all spoiled. Ein oseh tov, ein gam echad, no one does good, not even one person. In his Perush on Perek Yudalad, Rav Hirsch points out that this perhaps is an exaggeration, that no time in human history have we ever experienced a situation where no one is capable of doing good, but more likely he feels that instead of being understood literally that no one does any good, but rather that people with this attitude, that they feel there is no God, there is no higher morality, they do good only when it's expedient, only when it satisfies their interests and their particular wants and desires. But to do good just for goodness sake, that you need to have a feeling for a higher morality, which can only come from God. Halo yadu pole aven, ochle ami, achlu lechem. Don't the people who commit these sins know? Don't those who consume my nation, who consume them, who devour them like you would a loaf of bread or a meal? Elohim lo karao, they never call upon God. What's the end result for these people, however? Sham pachadu pachad. In the end, they will experience tremendous fear. Lo haya pachad, a fear such as never existed before. Ki Elohim pizar atzmot chonach, because God is going to scatter the bones of those who have camped against us. Hevishota ki Elohim ma'asam. God is going to put them to shame because God has rejected them. And then finally, with this, after this note of comeuppance, so to speak, the Perek continues with a more upbeat perspective, referring to the ultimate Yeshua. Mi yitain mitzion Yeshua Yisrael. Would that it be, who would give it so that the salvations of Israel would come out of Tzion? Beshuv Elohim shvut amo, when God returns the captivity of his people. Yagel Yaakov Yismach Yisrael. At that time Yaakov will rejoice and Yisrael will be happy. So this is the basic Perek. As I mentioned, it's very similar to Perek Yudalad with some important differences. And what I'd like to do now in the discussion is to focus on those differences and how we should understand these two prakim differently. Right? And in doing so, I would like to primarily focus on the Perush of Rav Hirsch, who has a very interesting perspective. He understands both prakim as speaking of an era where there's widespread spiritual and moral degeneration amongst mankind as a whole and even amongst the Jewish people. But nevertheless, in all of this, the concept of Israel stands out as a people of God in a godless world. And when you compare now the two prakim, they take subtle but very important different approaches to this. The most important difference, which Rav Hirsch and many of the other Mefarshim point out, is in the perspective of the name of Hashem that's used. In Perek Yudalad, the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the name Hashem that's associated with Midas HaChesed and Midas HaRachamim, is used almost in every pasuk. It's used in every time it's mentioned, implying that the Yeshua would come about as a result of this Midas HaRachamim, Midas HaChesed. In Nun Gimel, however, instead of using the name of Hashem, the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the Perek makes use of the term Elokim, which places an emphasis on God's judgment, His Midas Hadin, and His righteousness. And so we have two different Perek Yudalad. We have an emphasis on God's love and on His willingness to redeem Israel, and all of mankind as an act of chesed, whereas in Perek Nun Gimel, it's only when we bring it about through through deserving it, through what's considered to be the proper actions. Rav Hirsch points out that as a result, there's a practical difference here between the two of them. In Perek Yudalid, where the redemption would come about as an act of rachamim, it means that even if we're not deserving of the geula, when the time comes that the geula was meant to occur, God will bring it about anyway, and He will redeem us, even if we don't rise to the spiritual levels that would merit this particular act of God. But in Perek Nun Gimel, in contrast, where it's going to be an act of Midas Hadin, if we elevate ourselves to a state where we deserve the Geula, even if it's prior to the intended time, God will bring it about because we deserve it. So we have two pathways to the final salvation, to the final Geula. We can either wait it out until the time that was intended by God, or we can try and hasten it by elevating our spiritual nature, by elevating us through good deeds, and therefore bring about it as an act of the Midas Hadin. Another interesting difference between the two prakim is in the expression kulo sag, which is the expression used in Perek Nun Gimel, and in Perek Yudalad the expression is kulo sar. Kulo sar means everyone has turned aside, has turned off the pathway, have deviated from the proper path that they should be on. Of course, as Rav Hirsch puts out, that someone who deviates from the pathway always has the possibility of returning to the pathway, of doing tshuva and continuing in the proper path. But when the expression kulo sag is used, that everyone has become dross, everyone has become spoiled, everyone has become rotten, so to speak, it implies a state of no return, And as a result, there's a stricter sense here. Again, it's the Midas Hadin, where if we do achieve such a point, we're incapable of returning, incapable of coming back, then we're not going to experience the ultimate Yeshua. Both prakim end similarly with the promise of salvation, and specifically with the expression Yagel Yaakov Yismach Yisrael. And the Meir La'aretz, Rav Weiss from the Mir Yeshiva in Meir La'aretz, raises an important question about that. Why this emphasis on Yaakov? What about the other Avos? Wouldn't they also rejoice in our ultimate salvation? And to address that, he quotes a medrash which states that the reason Yaakov is mentioned, and here to quote the medrash, Yaakov mitztar kishe Yisrael mitztarim. Yaakov felt the same pain that we felt when we were in distress. Our distress was matched by his distress. Ukeshehem b'tzara, ulefichach eshetavo haga'ula liyisrael yismach imahem. And because Yaakov felt the same pain and the same distress that we felt, so too when we experience the salvation and experience the joy associated with the salvation, so too Yaakov will also rejoice at the time of our salvation, commensurate with our own rejoicing. And therefore the pasuk states, Yagel Yaakov Yismach Yisrael. Why, though, the Meir La'aretz asks, was Yaakov then more mitzvah than the other Avos? Why was he able to relate so much more closely to Klal Yisrael than Avram and Yitzchak, and that he is mentioned here and they appear to be excluded? And he gives an interesting answer. He says, all three of them, of course, have a parental relationship to Am Yisrael. They are our forefathers, they are our ancestors, and as such have the natural love that a parent would feel for their child. But with Yaakov, he has that, but he has something more. Yaakov was responsible for creating Klal Yisrael, and in particular establishing the relationship between Klal Yisrael as a nation, as Am Yisrael, and Hashem, a relationship that's compared by Chazal to that of Kiddushin, as a relationship between a Chassan and Kala. So here, Yaakov is not only when Israel is lost, when Israel is in trouble, when Israel is in distress, Yaakov is not only experiencing the pain of a parent, but he's also experiencing the pain of someone who's involved in a close marital relationship, and one that exists between us as a nation and Hashem. And so therefore the distress is even greater. But similarly, at the time of the ultimate salvation, at the time of the Geula, when we will be redeemed and we'll be brought back to Eretz Yisrael and our relationship will be established with Hashem the way it was originally, so too Yaakov will experience not only the joy of a parent experiencing the joy of his children, but also the joy of a chassan and a kala, someone involved in this personal, close relationship of love. And we testify to our recognition of this every day when we say Shema Yisrael, according to the Medrash. When we say Shema Yisrael, we're saying, hear Yaakov, listen Yisrael. Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem our God, Hashem Echad, He is one with us. We are united in our relationship with Him, and we are together. And we stand there to testify that because that means so much to Yaakov. It's an interesting question, an interesting response on the part of the Me'ila Aretz, but there are two important questions the Me'ila Aretz doesn't address. One is, why is it necessary to have one of the Avos rejoicing with us to begin with anyway? Is that something that's really necessary? Wouldn't it be enough just for us to experience the Geula itself? Wouldn't that be sufficient for our joy? And the second question is, if Yaakov, his relationship was one of empathy and compassion, he could relate to us in our times of sadness, how does that necessarily demonstrate that he'll relate equally well to us in our times of joy and happiness? As I mentioned, the Me'ila Aretz doesn't raise these questions and doesn't address them, and neither do any of the other Mefarshim. But I believe, when I thought about it, I believe I can get an answer from knowing Sarah Lamdrach. Sarah is someone who had tremendous empathy for others and tremendous care for other people. And she would certainly be somebody you could sit with and cry with over your distress. But nobody thinks of Sarah as someone to sit and cry with. Sarah was someone you laughed with. Sarah was full of simchas achayim. She was full of humor and joy and all good aspects of life, and it was impossible to feel sad or distressed in her presence. Her joy, her humor elevated your spirits. And I think the same is true, that whatever joy we will experience at the time of the Geula, it will pale in comparison to the joy that we will experience when our Avos, particularly Yaakov, who could commiserate so much with us, shares that joy and elevates our level of simcha through his own, the same way Sarah did with all that she encountered with. And again, just as she could be there when times were difficult and you felt it, her impact was so much greater when times were good. And I pray that hopefully we will experience this Yeshua b'mheira b'yameinu, and through it the Tchias HaMeitim, and we will once again have the wonderful pleasure of being with Sarah and experiencing her joy and laughter and just the wonderful Simchas HaChaim that it brings to all of us.